So in some ways I wanted to sort of tell a story in talking about how I make meaning of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. And it really starts sort of with my own pathways to sort of making meaning of who I was, and then a lot of different things that sort of came together about understanding how the world works. And so, being that I'm, very much involved in issues of diversity, multiculturalism, I think all the time about the sort of, what are the issues that we're facing today, and how can we actually name them, and be okay with naming them so that we can begin to work together to continue sort of the change that was launched by the American Civil Rights Movement. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself so you can understand sort of how I came to understand what I think I understand. And so to tell you, I'm a child of the Civil Rights Movement. I was the first generation of beneficiaries who were able to move and choose more freely in the United States that had finally outlawed racial terror and illegal discrimination. I was born in 1969, and both of my parents are from the segregated South. Both of them growing up in the 1940s and 50s. My father in Virginia in Newport News, his family had gone there to work in the shipyards from doing rural agricultural work. My mother is a country girl from North Carolina, very small town, and Jim Crow was a fact of their lives every day growing up. My parents were the first in their families to complete college. They both attended the same small, historically black state teachers college in North Carolina, Elizabeth City State, and they became public school educators. They were the first to become middle class, escaping poverty, and they moved as far north as Washington, D.C., where I was born, and they eventually settled in suburban rural Maryland, where I grew up. My mother began teaching in 1966 when schools in Virginia and Maryland were still segregated. The process of desegregation didn't begin in those areas until 1969, even though Brown versus Board of Education had been decided by the Supreme Court in 1954. And both of my parents spent their careers seeing the effects and wondering about the benefits for black children in new school scenarios where they were in the minority among students being taught by white teachers, many of whom did not have the skills to reach and support black students. So this is my parents' sort of career experiences. Starting out teaching when the schools were still segregated, seeing the process of desegregation, and sort of questioning and wondering what was happening. And then I grew up in a quagmire. Bred with the idea that education was the key to success, I was sent to private and Catholic schools in the 1970s and 80s, and a good, quote-unquote, suburban public high school, integrated schools where I, as an African American, was in the minority. I had had the privilege of growing up middle class, being afforded opportunities my parents never had, to take dance lessons, to be involved in theater and music, to eventually become a serious pre-professional dancer, to move in and among whites as friends and as peers. I was academically successful, so I was often viewed as an aberration by some white teachers and some white peers who didn't always hesitate to declare that I was different than those other black people. In high school, I was in the honors and AP track, often the only black person in my classes. I struggled to make meaning of my identity, to find acceptance among peers, to understand my in-between position as a member of this first generation of African Americans who straddled a new racial landscape, haunted by the legacy of racism that had so clearly shaped my parents' lives. I, like some of my generation, believed that racism was over, that it had all been fixed by Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, and that my parents' generation needed to get over what I perceived to be their obsession with race. My parents didn't understand me then, and now I understand that they did not have the tools to fully get my positionality and the complexities of racial change and racial belonging that I now share with a generation of young African Americans. I didn't fit their molds, and I was on the edges of new worlds that had not yet become intelligible to me. I didn't begin to figure out the quagmire of identity, of race, of racism for myself and my life's choices until I left Spelman College in 1987 to the dismay of my parents, and later entered what was for my parents a wild, unruly, and wholly unfamiliar college experience as a student of Friendswood College. Friendswood College was founded by the New York Yearly Meeting of Friends, who had a vision of shaping young people as world citizens by requiring them to live and study in cultures other than their own, and to have their curriculum shaped by the core of the world's problems. It was in Central America, in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, in South Texas, working with Central American refugees, and in my senior year in India that my life and experiences started to make sense. For me, it took stepping outside of the expectations of middle classhood and outside of the United States, living in Latin America and Asia, to feel the visceral effects of colonialism, slavery, racism, sexism, and poverty upon the world, and to begin to translate those experiences into meanings for my own life. It was in Central America that I became activist, outraged, troubled by the micro-assaults upon my personhood as a visibly African-descendant woman moving through the complexities of the world, and I turned to social justice as a focus of my life's work. Like many of my generation, I'd been taught Black history at home. I knew of the legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow, of the dangers and achievements of civil rights activism. My mother had been involved in sit-ins in Elizabeth City when she was in college. It had been impressed upon me from whence I came was immensely important for whither I was going. So being profoundly moved spiritually and intellectually, it began to make sense into my 20s and my 30s and now into my 40s as I in many ways put together the puzzles of my own life experiences to feel that I have a relatively coherent picture of what we are all facing in the 21st century. Racial, gender, sexual, and economic equality have by no means been achieved. What has been achieved with respect to race has been an end to overt racial terror and obvious in-your-face racial discrimination and unapologetic white supremacy. The end of legalized racism in many instances of overt hostility, however, does not mean that racism has ended. Now, in a post-nonviolent civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, in a post-Black Power, Chicano Power, Young Lords, post-American Indian movement, activist milieu of the 1970s, the post-1965 opening of immigration law and the entry of thousands of immigrants of color from around the world, and even in the age of Obama, we are still faced with profound racial and economic disparity in the United States. So I want to talk about the systemic nature of discrimination. Although Dr. Martin Luther King and other movement leaders and spokespeople made it clear that the end to de jure racial segregation, daily racial assaults, and overt exclusion from the benefits of U.S. society were not the only aims of the movement, we are often confused in our present day about how racism and racial discrimination work. It seems that in popular U.S. culture, the idea that if attitudinal racism, overtly racist comments, overtly racist behavior are not in the fore, that racism has somehow ended. However, what we see in the new millennium is a hardening of racialized structures that have bearing on economics in which peoples of color are systematically denied full participation in U.S. society. In its recent State of the Dream Report 2012, the organization United for a Fair Economy states very clearly that communities of color have borne the brunt of our nation's history of racism and white supremacy. Although there have been many social and economic gains made for all races, people of color continue to be left behind. Vast racial disparities still exist in wealth and income, education, employment, poverty, incarceration, and health. Extreme inequality continues to entrench racial disparities. And they go on further to say, a major demographic shift is underway in the United States. By 2030, the majority of U.S. residents under 18 will be youth of color. And by 2042, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and other non-whites will collectively comprise the majority of the U.S. population. While whites may be in the minority by 2040 and beyond, this report talks about that the overwhelming share of the nation's income and wealth will remain solidly in white hands. So while progress has definitely been made and the climate having to do with race has certainly shifted, it is important for us to move beyond a definition of racial discrimination as primarily in the hands of individuals. That what individuals think or feel about peoples of color, and assuming, particularly in the progressive, liberal, and friendly circles in which many of us move, as many of us here are associated with Germantown Friend School, is in some ways besides the point of racism and racial disparity. The historical and systemic forces that have oppressed African Americans and other people of color have resulted in a present day in which, for some of us, racist terror and daily overt assaults may have subsided, but the economic and social effects of racist policies and practices still live on with us today. As the researchers at United for a Fair Economy point out to us, disparities in income perpetuate poverty in communities of color and will continue to do so unless change is made. In 2010, the median family income of Black and Latino families was 57 cents to every dollar of white median family income. By 2042, the median Black family will still only earn about 61 cents on the dollar, and Latinos will earn 45 cents for every dollar of white median family income. Increasing wealth inequality entrenches the racial economic divide. White families who have more wealth are able to tap into it in times of hardship to avoid falling to the bottom of the economic ladder or to make investments in their future. If the trend from 1989 to 2007 continues, Black families by 2042 will have on average just 19 cents for each dollar of net wealth held by white families. Latinos would have 25 cents for each dollar. Education is one of the most important tools we have for increasing social mobility, yet dramatic disparities in education perpetuate inequality. And that's something I'm struck by every day. As much as I tremendously enjoy this community, I think it's important for us to recognize both the opportunity and the privilege that's very much a part of where we are, particularly being in Germantown, and sort of the troubled nature of Philadelphia schools as an example, that there are large disparities in terms of educational experience that people are having, and often those fall along the lines of race and class. The mass incarceration of people of color is historically unprecedented. Blacks are 6 times more likely to be in prison than whites, and people of color make up over 65% of the prison population. An astounding 68% of Black men born since the mid-1970s have prison records. And these are structural realities, creating real hardships for individuals and communities across the nation. And even in some places attitudes may have changed, the economic and social structures have not changed profoundly enough. While structural racism and economic disparity are serious problems for this generation to face, attitudinal racism still exists in its overt and in more subtle, covert forms. The legacy, it's a long legacy of deeming peoples of color inferior, denying them security and prosperity, and reserving privileges for whites has been long-standing in the United States. Even when not intentional, without the pervasive unlearning and relearning work that would be necessary to undo centuries of taken-for-granted attitudes and outlooks, racism and white supremacy are embedded in the mainstream American culture. Even among the well-meaning, there are daily microaggressions, misreadings, misspeech that reflects the legacy of learned, conscious, and unconscious racism. Akiba Solomon, writing for the publication Color Lines, wrote a piece exploring the racist jabs that are directed at Michelle Obama, particularly ones that you find in the media. This writer asks, you think talking about big racial issues like loan discrimination and redlining and police brutality against Black men is hard? It's often a lot easier than discussing race-based microaggressions. Solomon quotes the scholar Daryl Wing Su, who writes about micro-insults, verbal and nonverbal communications that subtly convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity, and micro-invalidations, communications that subtly exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color. Much of what people of color face, particularly in well-meaning circles, is often hard to name. It doesn't look like the hostile racism that our parents and grandparents faced, and in that sense, it is often difficult to identify. And while people of color navigate the difficult psychic terrain of microaggressive and unconscious forms of racism directed toward them, the U.S. has also not seen a significant enough decline of overt racist belief, language, and practice. The growth of white supremacist groups across the country, along with virulent anti-immigrant activism, policy, and discourse directed at people of color are alarming and present with us in 2012. In a recent article, The State of Hate, White Supremacist Groups Growing, which is published by the Leadership Conference, the civil rights group notes that the Southern Poverty Law Center identified 926 hate groups active in 2008, up more than 4% from the 888 groups in 2007, and far above the 602 groups documented in 2000. Barack Obama's election has inflamed racist extremists who see it as another sign that their country is under siege by non-whites. The idea of a Black man in the White House, combined with the deepening economic crisis and continuing high levels of Latino immigration, has given white supremacists a real platform on which to recruit. Right-wing extremists may be gaining new recruits by playing on their fears about several emergent issues: the economic downturn and the election of the first African-American president, present unique drivers for right-wing radicalization and recruitment. Exploiting the economic crisis, spreading propaganda that blames minorities and immigrants for the subprime mortgage meltdown. David Duke, a former Klan leader who was once a member of the Louisiana lecture, has said, "Obama is a visual aid that galvanizes the white supremacist movement." There are 30 active white supremacists and neo-Nazi groups in Pennsylvania, with only California, Florida, Delaware, Mississippi, and Tennessee surpassing our own state in this growing threat. So I'm thinking about anti-racism. So if racism is complex, if it's systemic, right, if it's personal, if it has to do with attitudes, if it has to do with what sort of behaviors that people may or may not be conscious about, how do we address it? How do we change it? And so I think about moving through the contours of my own life and identity development and committing myself to studying, learning, and teaching about injustice with the intent to help prepare people for work in social justice. I feel that I'm learning that being somewhat aware of issues of race and working racism doesn't cut it. Racism is deeper, and the process of undoing it is harder and more rigorous than mere personal awareness and individualized sensitivity. I believe that we have to fully recognize and work to transform the personal, systemic, economic, and attitudinal quagmires that our country is in with respect to race and racial equality. Our work today, I believe, our friends at United for a Fair Economy tell us that we need nothing less than a diverse, powerful social movement dedicated to advancing meaningful policy solutions on many fronts to reduce the racial divide. Foreclosure relief, federal aid to states, and targeted job creation programs are needed to both combat the current economic slump and to reduce racial economic disparities. Longer-term strategies including wealth-building programs, increasing taxes on the rich, strengthening safety net programs, ending the war on drugs, and humane immigration reform are needed in order to substantially reduce racial inequality. In reflecting on our work today, both our work in engaging in service and honor of the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and in our work to deal honestly with the ways in which racism has not broken its hold on U.S. society, I share some of the words of Martin himself, which are still relevant for us today. He said, in 1955, he said this, "I want to say that in all of our actions, we must stick together. Unity is the great need of the hour, and if we are united, we can get many of the things that not only we desire, but which we justly deserve. There is never a time in our American democracy that we must ever think we're wrong when we protest. Standing beside love is always justice, and we are only using the tools of justice. Not only are we using the tools of persuasion, but we've come to see that we've got to use the tools of coercion. Not only is this thing a process of education, but it's also a process of legislation. We've arrived at the point in life where we can see for ourselves a new destiny. Our horizons are broader. Each of us here, and those of us who are not here, have a responsibility in this great task." Thanks.